There is currently legislation working its way through Congress concerning countries that manipulate their currencies to gain unfair advantages for their export sector and that may violate international trade law. This has the potential to cause a major shift in U.S. trade policy and the global economy. First, I'll give a little background on the issues, and then I will offer an example of how competing interests on the trade policy issue may attempt to influence or have already influenced our political process in this case. First, some background on international trade. Since the end of World War II, international trade agreements and bodies like the World Trade Organization have gradually lowered barriers to commerce and the flow of capital. The last 2 decades have seen explosive growth in the developing world, especially the People's Republic of China. In the late 1980s, the Chinese government invited foreign direct investment and opened up its cities for industrial development. The result has been manufacturing companies from around the world moving their operations to China. Today, the PRC is called the world's factory. Most of the clothing, electronics, and appliances sold at Amazon.com, Best Buy, Toys R Us, and Macy's, for example, carry the label Made in China. This is one of the reasons why millions of manufacturing jobs have been lost in the United States since the 1990s. Companies that outsource or offshore operations take advantage of lower labor costs and weaker regulations. Some of the largest companies that have invested in Chinese operations include General Motors, BMW, Motorola, General Electric, and Hewlett Packard. Economist Stephen Roach coined the term global labor arbitrage, where a business basically shops around for optimal production environments. Some of those environments are located in countries that have lower wage levels and weaker standards for safety and bargaining rights. Companies also engage in arbitrage for weaker standards of corporate transparency and governance, environmental regulations, and exposure to litigation. One of my favorite sayings is, like water, capital follows the path of least resistance. Recent developments in management of supply chains, communication technology, and banking law make global labor arbitrage easier than ever. For American and European businesses, there is an entire industry of consultants such as Accenture, Infosys, and CB Richard Ellis that will connect them to suppliers and recruiter services, many of which are overseas. Walmart, the largest retailer in the world, has a division devoted to assisting domestic manufacturers on offshoring their operations in order to meet what they call the China price. Walmart often will not even deal with suppliers that manufacture in the United States. So when a condition of systemic global labor arbitrage exists, domestic American manufacturers are unable to compete with the China price. Either they are driven out of business or engage in arbitrage and outsourcing themselves to survive. A phenomenon that emerges in systemic global labor arbitrage is a race to the bottom. Now that it is getting easier to outsource business operations, almost everyone is doing it, and competing firms must seek out less and less costly labor pools to keep up with their rivals. The North American Free Trade Agreement that was enacted by Canada, the United States, and Mexico in 1994 was followed by many American factories moving to Mexico. When China joined the WTO as a full member in 2001, some of those factories in Mexico then packed up and moved to China as well. Under the rules of the WTO, countries that meet certain standards of human rights and environmental regulation are granted the status of Most Favored Nation, or MFN. In 1994, President Bill Clinton broke a campaign promise and renewed China's MFN status despite its record of human rights abuses. In theory, nations that have MFN status agree to lower tariffs and import quotas with every other member of the WTO. Accusations of rule violations are brought to the WTO and other trade courts. China's meteoric rise in economic strength is the direct result of its exporting policy. This trajectory has led to the consensus among macroeconomic observers that the 21st century is quote unquote the Chinese century. However, the race to the bottom phenomenon persists even in China. Rising inflation, labor unrest, and environmental damage have forced Chinese manufacturers to move from the coastal cities to the inner provinces. Some Chinese companies are even outsourcing to countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Nigeria. Foreign policy observers believe that after the 1989 Tiananmen Square incident, the ruling Communist Party made a grand bargain with the Chinese people that the Beijing government would promise to rapidly grow the economy in return for letting them stay in power. Therefore, maintaining China's exporting powerhouse is the critical focus of the Beijing government and is the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy. As a result of financial and housing bubble collapses, most of the industrialized world have experienced a global economic slowdown and increasing unemployment for several years now. With no recovery expected in the near term, some experts believe that our unemployment condition is structural instead of cyclical. In other words, that this is the new normal. There is mounting pressure from voters in many nations to return to protectionism, to preserve what industrial sectors they have left. These measures include tariffs, which are today called countervailing duties. Another measure is an anti-dumping duty. Dumping is the practice of exporting a product at such a low price as to intentionally try to put a competitor out of business. Historically, the use of tariffs have led to cycles of retaliatory tariffs, also known as trade wars, and some have even led to military conflict. Trade regimes like the World Trade Organizations were formed for the purpose of preventing trade wars. It is important to note that some tariffs and trade barriers do exist and are actually allowed under WTO rules, but most governments still accept WTO rules as the foundation of the modern international system. The United States and the European Union have brought several anti-dumping cases in China in recent years involving steel, tires, chemical, and mechanical products. Most nations have a manufacturing sector to some degree, and those that have enough capacity and capability are able to offer their products on the international market. However, some classes of products can be produced by China at a much lower cost. China's manufacturing sector has massive economies of scale and are able to bring products to market much faster. In an article in Wired magazine, a writer recommended that if an American hobbyist designed a machine part, he should use a Chinese factory to produce a small batch and have it shipped back to the US. So if a country cannot easily enact protective tariffs, it has other policy options to promote their exports. In recent years, some countries have used their central banks to devalue their currencies for many reasons, like promoting consumer spending and home buying. Exporters have also found devaluation beneficial in making their products cheaper and more attractive in other countries. Since the collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement and the gold standard system in 1971, the value of most national currencies floated against each other. The process of currency markets is complicated and a bit beyond the scope of this discussion, but basically trade imbalances occur when one country imports more products than they export. In theory, in a purely floating currency system, trade balances are supposed to resolve themselves when countries buy back their own currencies. A government may find it easy to devalue its currency to promote trade, but when everyone starts to do it, it may lead to severe market distortions and inflation. China's central bank does not allow its yuan currency to completely float in the international market. Using a narrow tranche, it artificially depreciates the value of the yuan against the value of the US dollar. As of early October 2011, the US dollar is worth 6.37 Chinese yuan. One proposed remedy to this situation is to file a complaint against China at the World Trade Organization. Legislation is gaining momentum in Congress to initiate a series of responses to try and get China to float its currency and to allow the yuan to appreciate in value. There are myriad arguments over the United States public spending, sovereign debt, and monetary policy, but that is for another discussion. I personally hold strong views on U.S. trade policy, but I will try to offer an even-handed presentation of my hypothesis. What follows is one example of how I believe industries may influence the legislative process of our government. In the U.S. Senate, there is a piece of legislation called S1619, the Currency Exchange Rate Oversight Reform Act of 2011. If S1619 passes the Senate, and if its companion legislation in the House of Representatives passes, and if it is signed into law by the President, it may be executed in this way. The Secretary of Commerce will report to Congress every 6 months about currency exchange rates. If we designate that a country's currency to be, quote, fundamentally misaligned, unquote, we can recalculate the price of imports from that country to account for the manipulated rate. This new rate may be used to calculate countervailing or anti-dumping duties later on if necessary. We can also send the U.S. Trade Representative to the World Trade Organizations to file a complaint against that country. Another response is to bar government agencies from buying anything from that country. And we can also ask multilateral banks like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, or the Asian Development Bank not to finance any project in that country. This legislation constitutes a major threat to China's manufacturing sector and exports. I do not doubt that China will focus diplomatic pressure on our leaders and policymakers. While similar pieces of legislation have been attempted before, S1619 came to prominence rather quickly. It was introduced in September 22nd of 2011, and it already went through a cloture vote on October 5th of 2011. And according to the U.S. Senate Handbook, a cloture is the only procedure by which the Senate can vote to place a time limit on consideration of a bill or other matter, and thereby overcome a filibuster. Under the cloture rule, the Senate may limit consideration of a pending matter to 30 additional hours, but only by vote of 3/5 of the full Senate, normally 60 votes. The result of the October 5th cloture vote was 62 yeas and 38 nays. Basically, it means opponents of this legislation will not be able to filibuster or delay it. It will have to be debated and voted on soon. Let's see who voted yay. 12 Republicans, 39 Democrats, and 1 independent. And who voted nay? 34 Republicans and 3 Democrats. Let's see which Democrats voted nay. Patty Murray, Democrat from Washington State. Maria Cantwell, the other Democrat senator from Washington. And Claire McCaskill, Democrat from Missouri. So 3 Democrats broke party ranks and voted nay, and 2 of them were both senators from Washington State. Most Republicans tend to support policies that favor business groups and free trade, and most Democrats tend to support policies that favor labor unions and the use of trade policy to further human rights overseas. Historically, the Chinese government favored Republicans since it is the party of Richard Nixon who normalized diplomatic relations with China. Democrats are more likely than Republicans to support the cause of ethnic Tibetans, human rights, and environmental activism in China, but I digress. So, what conditions are unique in Washington State that made its 2 senators vote against S1619? Let's look at the Evergreen State. Washington State has one of the highest gross domestic products in the U.S. In 2010, it produced $340 billion in products and services, with a population of only 6.7 million. According to Wikipedia, its major export industries are aircraft manufacturing. Boeing's main plants are in Washington. The state also has several large aluminum operations. Washington also produces lumber and wood products, and the company Weyerhaeuser is a major employer. There's also a huge agricultural sector, producing apples, grapes, potatoes, barley, wheat, and strawberries. When China is faced with mounting criticism and threats of trade barriers in Congress, it is plausible that they will attempt to deter any action by threatening to bar exports from the states or districts which hostile legislators may represent. It is reasonable to assume that legislators representing export-dependent districts will vote in such a way to mitigate the risk of trade war and to maintain continuity of business operations and tax revenue. It is my belief that the nays on the S1619 cloture vote is a reflection of this direct or indirect influence. There are also major well-known companies that are headquartered in Washington state and that are reliant on labor and supply chains in China. Amazon, the online retailer's most successful product is their Kindle Series e-reader and soon tablet computer. The Kindle is manufactured in China. Interestingly, the Kindles that have 3G capability are able to access Amazon's network as well as the internet within China, and they're not subject to the firewalls or filtering of the state censorship authorities. Isn't it ironic that the hundreds of thousands of Chinese workers that make the Kindle cannot enjoy the free exchange of ideas that the Kindle offers? Another company headquartered in Washington is Microsoft, which manufactures their Xbox gaming console in China. Nintendo of America makes their Wii gaming console in China. And Costco and Nordstrom's also rely on suppliers from China for their electronics and consumer goods. Legislation like S1619 increases the potential of U.S. import tariffs. For example, Apple may use a company like Foxconn to manufacture iPhones and iPads, but when they try to ship it back into the US, they may have to pay a tariff at the port if we do reenact tariffs. Protectionist advocates believe that tariffs may increase the price of the product to the point where it will be more cost efficient to manufacture them inside the US, and therefore firms would have to employ American workers instead of outsourcing. As I stated before, one of China's highest priorities is to maintain its export manufacturing sector, but it would be highly controversial for China to directly try to influence an American election. American companies, on the other hand, have interests that are aligned and parallel to China's, and the campaign finance process is much more open for American companies. I'm going to present a list of the top contributors to the campaigns of Senators Murray and Cantwell from 2007 to 2011, and some of the contributions are slated for elections in 2012 also. This information is available from opensecrets.org, an excellent public advocacy site that collates and organizes campaign donation data from the Federal Election Commission. I highly recommend that everyone visit opensecrets.org just to see who contributed to their own representatives' campaigns. Note that I have nothing personal against Senators Murray or Cantwell. I'm sure they are exemplary legislators and members of the community. I am also not picking on Democrats or Republicans in particular. If you examine campaign contributions for any elected official and their policy decisions, you may find a close correlation with the goals of those industries or groups. Again, this discussion is a pure hypothesis of political economy, and these two senators just happen to provide a clear case of the maxim, all politics is local. Alright, Senator Patty Murray, this is a list of her top contributors. At number 2, Microsoft, which gave her $399,000. Boeing gave her $172,000. Weyerhaeuser gave her almost $66,000. Amazon gave her almost $60,000, and Costco gave her $52,000. Now, Senator Cantwell received $277,000 from Microsoft. That was her top contributor. She also received $86,000 from Boeing and almost $41,000 from Amazon.com. Note that each senator has received money from many other groups, including those on opposite sides of the issues. To conclude, I believe that a legislator has to weigh the opportunity cost of every vote they cast. In other words, who can they alienate at the lowest possible political cost? This calculus is at the heart of how our political system functions and how interest groups, be they individual firms, labor unions, or industry trade groups, attempt to influence public policy. Legislation like S 1619 is not the first and won't be the last in attempts by our government to manage economic difficulties. I hope this discussion encourages further reading on the issue. I recommend the following sites as starting points for further exploration. I already mentioned opensecrets.org. A similar site is maplight.org. Another website that goes into more detail about a whole myriad of issues is publicagenda.org, and opencrs.org is a resource of publicly available reports from the Congressional Research Service. This is a public agency, taxpayer funded, that produces outstanding and even-handed reports on a whole list of issues, much more detailed than what is presented in media outlets and internet.